4,000 years ago, the creator of the universe made an everlasting covenant with Abraham. All the land, from the Euphrates to the Nile, belongs to the sons of Israel. Shock waves will shake the earth as heaven reaches down to fulfill that promise. Every nation that attempts to interfere with that covenant will march onto the battlefield against the Almighty. Prepare for a rude awakening. The Creator's calendar and the restoration of all things. Introducing the astronomically and agriculturally corrected Biblical Hebrew calendar. With your host, Michael Rood.
Part of this teaching could be entitled The Restoration of the Creator's Calendar and the Hurricane Katrina. And why I say this is that Nehemiah Gordon and I were traveling in the United States, and we had set up for over 2 months in advance to film this particular teaching, this particular presentation in a studio in Slidell, Louisiana. And so each night as we went around teaching this, we were making our preparations for being there in Slidell, Louisiana, where it would all be recorded there and then distributed throughout the world. Now, in the few days before then, Hurricane Katrina began making its way up through the Gulf of Mexico. And according to the arc that it was taking, it looked like it was going to go right straight into New Orleans. And we got together with our staff and we prayed. So while we were praying, I pictured in my mind's eye that the hurricane would take a direct turn to the south, and then we would be able to film as we had planned in Slidell, Louisiana. Now it is just a couple of days before we were to get on the plane and to leave for our filming in Slidell. I woke up 4 o'clock in the morning to see what was going on with the hurricane, and the newscaster was showing a satellite picture with a graphic on it that showed that right at 12 o'clock the evening before, while we were teaching, the hurricane took an abrupt turn at 45-degree angle and hit Slidell, Louisiana. His exact words, it took an abrupt turn and hit Slidell, Louisiana directly. Now, I thought, what are the chances of that? It took an abrupt turn and hit Slidell, the place where we're supposed to film this. Well, while I was teaching the previous evening, a gentleman came to us and said that he had the ability to film this in case things went bad in Louisiana. We could do it back here in Sacramento. So we had that as an option. We did then come back to Sacramento, and that day, if anything could go wrong, everything went wrong. And after I was into the teaching by about a half hour, I heard a voice that said, "This is not going to work." And I was willing to fight against it, wherever this voice comes from, I don't know, but it happened 3 times while I was teaching that this teaching is not going to happen here. And then we found out about 15 minutes into Nehemiah's portion, after I taught for 2 hours, that in fact there was an electronic failure, and we told him, turn out the cameras, it's over with. Now when I got back to Israel, I had a dream, a very vivid dream. This is not one of my normal dreams. This wasn't from eating pizza or anything else. It was a dream that was so vivid, I was taken above the earth and I was looking down on that same screen, seeing the satellite photograph and seeing that 45-degree angle as the hurricane took that route and hit Slidell. And as I looked down on that, I said, why did the hurricane take an abrupt turn, just like we prayed for, an abrupt turn, but it hit Slidell directly. And I heard a voice speak to me and say, the judgment of the Almighty is going to change your plans for ministry. And then I said, as I pictured Sacramento and looked at Sacramento on the map, well, why didn't this work in Sacramento? We did everything we could to make this happen in Sacramento. Why didn't it happen in Sacramento? Right by the San Andreas Fault. And again, I heard the voice say, the judgment of the Almighty is going to change your plans for ministry. And all of a sudden, it was so obvious. That's exactly what we saw. And it was that settling in. It was not something that I can describe. It was just the knowing at that moment, that is it. It's so obvious. It is so there. It is so real. And then I said, why didn't I see this before? And the voice said, because you weren't supposed to see it before. Now you need to know. Ladies and gentlemen, with everything that we have attempted to do to bring you the Creator's calendar, the Creator's reckoning of time, so that you do not need to be ignorant of His times and His seasons, so that you will know that the Almighty rules the universe by His calendar, by His time clock, and He will fulfill His feast in His time frame. And now it is all being done from the land of Israel, because this is the very place that the Almighty says that in the last days that the Torah, the instructions, will go forth from Zion. His word will go forth from Jerusalem around to the nations of the world, and you are about to see it, because this time of the birth pangs, of the travail that is coming upon the earth, you are living in those very days. And if things look a little bit scary right now, don't be too concerned, because they're going to get a lot worse. But be confident in this one thing, that the Almighty has us in the palm of His hands, and there's nothing that the world can do. There is nothing that the troubles and the tribulations in this world, there is nothing that we are going to experience that is not common to man. But God is able to keep us into the palm of His hands. He is able to keep us in the time of testing, in the time of trouble. And just as He has left the remains of Sodom and Gomorrah, just on the other side of these Judean hills, past the Judean wilderness, out of the city of Gomorrah, just as He has left that testimony in the earth, in those chunks of brimstone for a testimony in the last days, be reminded that He has left them as a testimony. He has given us this land again as His testimony that He fulfills His word, and that He is able to judge and will righteously judge the wicked in the last days, and He is also able to keep the righteous in the day of judgment, just as He kept righteous Lot. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Nehemiah Gordon is going to take you into the depths of the biblical calendar and explain it from his background, being raised as a Pharisee, and now as a Karaite, as a scripturalist, as he takes us into the Creator's reckoning of time. And then I'm going to be back and show you its fulfillment and its application in the first four Gospels, and then finally at the end, in the final gospel, the good news of the revelation of Yahshua Messiah as He fulfills the fall feast of the Lord. The Creator's calendar is absolutely essential in understanding the first four Gospels, and it is indispensable in understanding the fulfillment of the book of Revelation as the Messiah fulfills the fall feast of the Lord.
We live in an amazing time of restoration. For nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people were scattered across the lands of the dispersion, and now we're back in the land of Israel, the land promised to our forefathers, the land flowing with milk and honey. For 2,000 years, my Jewish ancestors were scattered to the four corners of the earth, living as second-class citizens in the lands of their exile, speaking the foreign languages of their captors. And now I can walk down the streets of Jerusalem, the capital of an independent Jewish state, speaking the language of my ancestors, the Hebrew language. And this miraculous fulfillment of biblical prophecy is something that happened gradually over a period of about 150 years. It began in around 1880 with the resurrection of the Hebrew language, which had laid dormant for nearly 2,000 years. After that, we saw the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. That was followed in 1948 by the establishment of an independent Jewish state. And finally, in 1967, the liberation of Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the Jewish state. This restoration began very humbly with a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda. He was a scholar who actually taught himself to speak the Hebrew language. And he had a dream to restore the Hebrew language, which had lied dormant for so long. It was actually a dead language. And in all of history, a dead language had never been brought back to life. And even today, the Hebrew language is the only language that's ever been revived from a dormant state. Well, Eliezer ben Yehuda taught himself Hebrew, and it began in 1881 when he got on a boat and arrived in the port of Jaffa with his wife. And when he arrived in Jaffa, Eliezer ben Yehuda turned to his wife and he said, "My beloved, these are the last words I am going to speak to you in the language that we were brought up in. Henceforth, we will only speak the Hebrew language." And this was fine for Eliezer ben Yehuda. He was a scholar and he had taught himself to speak this dead language, but his wife didn't speak a word of it. And it was very difficult for her. For months and months she studied and gradually learned to say words and then sentences, and finally she could talk. Actually, in the beginning it was pretty good for Eliezer because his wife couldn't talk. She just had to listen. But she eventually learned the language, and then this young couple was living in Jerusalem, walking around the streets speaking this dead language. And for most people this was an oddity. It would be like if two people walked around speaking Pig Latin or some dead language no longer existing. And here they were speaking this language which they'd revived. Well, most people didn't take it too seriously at first, but what really brought the Hebrew language back to life was when Eliezer ben Yehuda's first son was born. A few years after they arrived in Jerusalem, his wife had a child, and as she held her baby on her bosom just after he was born, Eliezer went to her and said, "You must make me a solemn vow that you will never speak to this child in any language other than Hebrew." And that boy's name was Ben Zion, son of Zion, born in Jerusalem, and he was the first Hebrew speaker for 2,000 years, the first native Hebrew speaker. It was no longer a man and his wife speaking this artificial language that neither of them really were raised up in, but now there was a child who spoke this as his authentic original language. And this was really the moment when Ben Zion was born that the Hebrew language was brought back to life. A few years later, Eliezer ben Yehuda then had a daughter, and now the son and the daughter could speak to each other in Hebrew, and they were the first native Hebrew speakers in 2,000 years. This was a miraculous fulfillment of biblical promises. The problem was, though, they were the only children that could speak Hebrew, and they had no one to speak to. They didn't have children they could play with and speak to in Hebrew. All the other children in Jerusalem spoke Yiddish or Arabic or other foreign languages that Jews learned in these lands of their exile. Well, the problem with this was that the Hebrew language has different forms for masculine and feminine, and as a result, the two children couldn't experience the full range of the Hebrew language unless they could speak to both a man and a woman. Speaking to each other, the boy can only speak in feminine and the girl in masculine. So what the father did is he got a dog for the boy and a cat for the girl, and he said to them, "From now on you will speak to the dog in masculine and to the cat in feminine." And by this means the children were able to experience the full range of Hebrew linguistic forms. And Hebrew started to take off as a vibrant, living language at this point. Well, the story goes that one day, Ben Zion, son of Zion, his name was, the boy, he was out in the street playing with his dog, and he shouts to his dog in Hebrew and says, "Kelev, bo hena!" "Dog, come here," he shouts to him in Hebrew. And the neighborhood children, the Jewish children of the neighborhood, they heard the Hebrew being shouted in the street, and they thought, this is very strange. Who is speaking Hebrew in the street? And they go over and they see the boy speaking to his dog, and they say, "What are you doing? Hebrew is the language of the synagogue. It's the language of our prayers. It's the language we read the Torah in. It's not a language you speak in the street. And it's certainly not a language you speak to a dog, the holy tongue." And the story goes that the irate children who spoke Yiddish and Arabic, these Jewish children, they picked up rocks and they stoned the dog. And this was one of the great tragedies of the restoration of the Hebrew language. It wasn't an easy thing that just happened out of the thin air. It took great work and dedication and suffering. But eventually, it was successful. And at this point, Eliezer ben Yehuda was proclaimed a heretic in Jerusalem. The leaders of Jerusalem came to him and they said to him, "Who do you think you are to restore the Hebrew language?" That's what they said to him. They said, "God has sent us into exile, ripped our language from us. Only God can restore that language. Who do you think you are to restore it?" Well, Eliezer persevered, and so did his children and his wife. And eventually, after about 50 years, a generation grew up speaking the Hebrew language as their native mother tongue. And today, generation after generation has been raised up 125 years later, speaking the Hebrew language. Today we're experiencing a similar thing in the restoration of the biblical calendar. What Eliezer ben Yehuda went through 125 years ago, we're now going through over the past few decades as the biblical calendar is being restored. And people are saying, "Who gave you the authority to restore the biblical calendar? God sent us into exile. Only God can restore that calendar. And until he restores the calendar, we have to continue to following the man-made calendars of the exile." Now, many of you hearing this may not know what I'm talking about. You may not realize that the modern calendar followed by most Jews today is actually not the biblical calendar. And in fact, any Jew with any kind of Jewish education knows that the modern Jewish calendar was established by Hillel II. Hillel II was a rabbi who in the year 359 convened the Sanhedrin, the supreme ruling council of the Pharisees. And he convened it because the Pharisees were in a great crisis. The Romans had issued a proclamation abolishing the Sanhedrin. And so before the Sanhedrin was abolished, before the Jews, the last final remaining Jews in the land of Israel went off into exile, Hillel II convened the Sanhedrin for an emergency meeting, their last meeting ever, to decide what they would do about the biblical calendar. Now, up until that time, the biblical calendar had worked based on the agriculture and astronomy of the land of Israel. And now the Jews were being sent off into the lands of the exile, the last remaining Jews. So Hillel II said to the Sanhedrin, "We need a system to use in these distant lands of the exile. If we're living off in Lithuania or Morocco, thousands of miles from the land of Israel, we can't very well look at the new moon or the agriculture in the land of Israel to follow the biblical calendar." And so what Hillel II did is he set up an approximated system, a system that would guesstimate when the biblical timings would be. In the biblical calendar, the years were based on the ripening of the Aviv barley and the months and the visibility of the new moon. For years, Hillel II instituted a 19-year calculated cycle, which was a guesstimation and approximation, which isn't so bad. For the technology of the day, this was correct about 66% of the time. If you're off thousands of miles from Israel and you don't know what's happening in the land, it's a pretty good guess. And he did a similar thing for the calendar, for the months in the calendar. Instead of each month beginning with the sighting of the new moon in the land of Israel, it would begin based on an average calculation of conjunction. And Hillel II replaced the sighting of the new moon in the land of Israel with a calculation of average conjunction, which again was cutting edge technology of the time, and it gave a good estimate of approximately when the biblical timings would be. And from the very beginning, Hillel II said that this would be the calendar to be used throughout the era of exile until the Jews returned to the land of Israel and the Messiah would rebuild the temple. Until that time, Jews would follow this approximated system, and only when the Messiah came would the biblical calendar be restored. Today we're back in the land of Israel. The largest Jewish community in the world is in the land of Israel, no longer in the lands of the diaspora. And the question becomes, why are we not returning to the biblical calendar? And this is a question many people began to ask about 20 years ago. And they began to look for new moons and look at the Aviv barley, the agricultural cycles of the land, and gradually relearn this information that was lost after over 1,000 years, and to reinstitute the biblical calendar, to continue to follow it, to resume where we left off. Now, the biblical calendar, as I mentioned, is based on a cycle of months and a cycle of years. The cycle of months is pretty simple. They're lunar months based on the sighting of the new moon, and the lunar month can be either 29 or 30 days. The way you determine the length of the month is that after 29 days, you go out and you look for the moon. If you don't see the new moon, then the following evening is then by default new moon, because quite simply with the lunar cycle it can only be 29 or 30 days. I remember when I first learned about this many years ago, when I was very young in fact, and I was growing up in the diaspora in the United States, and I remember very distinctly that for every biblical holiday, my family actually observed each holiday for 2 days. And this is called Yom Tov Sheni. Any Jew living in the diaspora knows what this is. And what that means is, for example, if in Leviticus 23 we're commanded to keep the Feast of Shavuot, or in English Pentecost, for 1 day, then a Jew in the diaspora will keep it for 2 days. And I remember asking my father, well, why are we keeping this for 2 days? I'd begun to read Leviticus, and I saw it was only a 1-day holiday. And the same thing with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The first day and the seventh day are days of rest, of no work. So in my family, we would do the first and second, and then the seventh and the eighth. Why are we doing these things for 2 days? I asked my father. And he explained to me that originally Jews would look for the new moon throughout the land of Israel, and then they would come and report that the new moon was sighted in Jerusalem, and then a proclamation would go forth from Jerusalem announcing to the world that the new moon was sighted. However, if you lived very far away in the exile, if you lived even back then in Babylonia or in Egypt, these faraway lands which you really couldn't find out if the moon was sighted in these lands distant from Israel, then what you did is you simply kept both days. Remember, I mentioned how the moon can only be on one of 2 days, either after the 29th day or after the 30th day. So if you're in exile, you just keep both days. And there's, you keep both just to be on the safe side. And this was done going back more than 2,000 years by Jews living in these distant parts of the exile. And to this very day, my father explained, Jews in the exile, in the lands of the diaspora that is, continue to follow the second day of every biblical holiday. And I said to him, well, wait a minute. Today we have, this is before the internet, back then we had telephones. I said, Dad, we have telephones. Why don't we call up in the land of Israel and find out when they saw the new moon? And he explained to me that actually today nobody looks for the new moon anymore. Hillel II came along in 359, and with the last Sanhedrin instituted this calculated calendar. So actually today we know hundreds of years in advance when the new moon day is expected to be, and whether the new moon appears on that day or not, it's considered new moon day. And I said, well, now we're back in Israel. I mean, we were living in the diaspora, but there are Jews back in Israel. Why don't we go back to following the biblical calendar? And even if we follow this Hillel II calendar, why are we keeping a second day for every biblical holiday, which has to do if you don't know when the moon was seen, when no one's even looking for the moon, and even when the moon is seen, you go by this calculation ignoring the moon. And my father said, well, the reason we follow this system, which is no longer based on the realities of the astronomy and agriculture, is that we're following an ancient tradition. And as Tevye said in Fiddler on the Roof, the reason that we do these things are tradition! Tradition! Well, I wasn't satisfied with this answer. And I really wanted to go by the biblical calendar. I didn't see any reason we had to follow this approximated calculation, which later I found out was off by between 1 and 2 days every month, when we could simply go out and look for the new moon. Let's back up a little bit and understand how the biblical calendar is actually hardwired into the very fabric of creation. We're first told about the biblical calendar in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. And there it says, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to separate between daytime and nighttime, and they shall be for signs, for appointed times, for days and for years. And the Hebrew word there for appointed times is often translated as seasons, but actually appointed times is more accurate. The Hebrew word is moadim. And moadim, or the singular moed, means a time that's set, an established time. And what it's telling us here is that the lights in heaven, the sun and the moon, somehow are indicators for us for the appointed times, for the biblical feasts, for the feasts of the Lord. Our next clue comes in Psalm 104:19. And there we're told, Asa yarech moadim. He made the moon for appointed times. He made the moon for moadim. And so clearly the biblical calendar has something to do with the moon. But what exactly does it have to do with the moon? One of the things people say to me all the time is, show me a verse in Scripture where it says to look for the new moon. And there actually isn't a verse that says that, and the reason is that the very Hebrew word for month means new moon. The Hebrew word for month is chodesh, and the Hebrew word chodesh literally means new moon. You can see it used that way throughout Scripture. For example, 1 Samuel chapter 20, the word chodesh appears with the literal sense of new moon. Now, if the word for month means new moon, it's a pretty good guess that are a pretty good conclusion to say that the month is actually based on the sighting of the new moon. The Hebrew word for chodesh, month, new moon, comes from the word chadash, which means new or renewal. And actually this is a word that many people are familiar with from the phrase Brit Chadashah. Brit Chadashah is the Hebrew word which is often translated as New Testament. What it literally means, though, is renewed covenant. Brit is covenant, Chadashah is new or renewal. And the Hebrew idea of Chadash is not something brand new that never existed before. The idea is actually a renewal. And that's what Jeremiah 31 is talking about. The covenant has been broken, and in the future period that Jeremiah is talking about, this covenant will be renewed. And that's exactly what a chodesh, a new moon, is. The month is not visible for several days. You go out and you look for the moon for several days and you don't see it. And then the light of the moon, or the visibility of the moon, is renewed to observers looking for it up on the western horizon shortly after sunset. Now, the way the lunar cycle works, here we can see the sun, the moon, and the earth in a straight line, and this is what's known as the moment of conjunction. And at this point, you simply can't see the moon because when you look up, all you see is the sun. That's the first reason. The second reason you don't see the moon is that the side of the moon facing us on Earth is not illuminated. Now, here's a very important point that a lot of people don't get. 50% of the moon is always illuminated. Even at this moment of conjunction, half the moon is lit up, except the half that's lit up is not facing Earth. And so we can't see it. A day or two later, you have what then is actually the visible new moon. At that point, 50% of the moon is still illuminated. However, now enough of it is facing Earth that when we look up on the western horizon shortly after sunset, we can see the moon as a tiny sliver crescent. And this is what it actually looks like looking at the horizon from Jerusalem. This is a new moon sighted from Jerusalem. Here's another new moon which you can see from Jerusalem. Any simple ancient Israelite shepherd or farmer goes up to any hilltop and he can't miss seeing the new moon. It's just so clear. The ancient Israelites were so in tune with the cycles of nature. They didn't have artificial lights. They woke up with first light and they went to sleep after the complete darkness. I mentioned how in ancient times the new moon was proclaimed from Jerusalem. What they would do is they would light a bonfire at the top of one of the hills next to Jerusalem, and then someone on a far distant hill would see that bonfire and he would light a bonfire, and this created a string of bonfires at the top of all of the hills all across the land of Israel. And people far away, hundreds of miles from Jerusalem, knew almost instantaneously that the new moon had been sighted from Jerusalem, unless you lived very far away in Babylonia or in Egypt. And in that case, you couldn't see the bonfires and you had to keep 2 days for every biblical feast. Well, today we live in a miraculous age where we can click a button and send an email around the world, and even the people in the farthest reaches of the diaspora don't have to keep 2 days. They can find out instantaneously that the new moon was sighted from Jerusalem. For a number of years now, we've been reporting these new moon sightings from Jerusalem. On my website, you can sign up for a free newsletter at karaites.com. And you get a free newsletter finding out instantaneously when the new moon was sighted. And so really there's no more excuse today to be following this Hillel 2 calendar, which was based on the idea that the Jews would be sent off into the exile. Hey, excuse me. I'm down here in the corner, in the Karaite corner. Before we continue, we need to look at a very important question concerning New Moon Day. We've just learned that the new moon is the beginning of the biblical month. But the question still remains, what is the status of New Moon Day? Is the new moon a day of rest like the Sabbath and the appointed times? In Numbers chapter 28, it says that a special sacrifice must be brought on the day of the new moon. But is New Moon Day really a day of rest? Recently, some people have suggested that the day of the new moon is a day of rest. They base this on an interesting passage in Amos chapter 8, verse 5. In that passage, the prophet rebukes the ancient Israelite merchants who could not wait to sell their grain to the poor. The prophet quotes the merchants who say in their hearts, "When will the new moon pass so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale?" In this verse, the merchants are eagerly anticipating the end of the Sabbath and the new moon so they can sell their grain to the needy. It's clear why the merchants want the Sabbath to end. We are commanded to refrain from all work on the Sabbath, and that includes engaging in any form of commerce, such as buying and selling. In fact, in Nehemiah chapter 13, the people are rebuked for selling their wares on the Sabbath. The merchants in Amos want the Sabbath to end so they can finally sell their grain. But why are the merchants so eager for the new moon to end? This seems to imply that it was forbidden to sell grain on the new moon, just as it was on the Sabbath. Based on this verse, some people have recently suggested that the new moon must be observed as a day of rest, even though that it is not commanded anywhere in the Torah. They also point out that there are a number of verses in Scripture in which the new moon and Sabbath appear side by side. For example, in Isaiah 66, verse 23, the prophet speaks about the new heavens and the new earth in the end times, saying, "And it shall come to pass, every new moon and every Sabbath, all flesh shall come to bow down before me, says Jehovah." So in the future era, when the King Messiah reigns over the earth, every human being will come to worship before Jehovah every Sabbath and every new moon. On a side note, we can see that in the future Messianic era, the Sabbath will still be kept. Another verse in which the Sabbath and new moon appear side by side is 2 Kings chapter 4. In that passage, we read about the Shunammite woman who is a disciple of the prophet Elisha. Elisha blesses the barren woman with a son. When her son dies, she decides to quickly go to the prophet for guidance. In verse 22, we read as follows. "And she called her husband and she said, 'Send me please one of the young servants and one of the she-donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and afterwards return.' And he answered, 'Why do you go to him today? Today is neither new moon nor Sabbath.' Clearly the Shunammite woman had a custom of going every new moon and every Sabbath to hear the words of the prophet. Interestingly enough, this woman's custom of going to the prophet is probably the forerunner of the synagogue. Today the main function of the synagogue is for public prayer by rote. But before the destruction of the Second Temple, the first synagogues were places for the people to gather to hear the words of Scripture read out loud every Sabbath. Originally, the people would go every Sabbath to hear the words from the prophets themselves. Later, when prophecy ceased, the people would gather at the synagogues to hear the words of the prophets recorded in Scripture. In verse 24, we see that the Shunammite woman goes to hear the words of the prophet not only every Sabbath, but also every new moon. Verses such as these have suggested to some people that the new moon was intended as a day of rest, just like the Sabbath. The problem with this idea is that the Torah never actually commands us to rest on the day of the new moon. Then how could the prophet Amos command us to do so? The Torah itself forbids us from adding new laws. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2, "You shall not add unto the matter which I command you today, nor shall you diminish anything from it." We are specifically forbidden from adding new laws to the Torah of Moses, just as we are forbidden from abolishing laws. This appears a second time in Deuteronomy 12:32. "All that I am commanding you shall diligently do. You shall not add to it or diminish from it." Again, we are forbidden to add to the Torah. Even a prophet such as Amos will be forbidden to add to the Torah. This is made clear in the very next verses that follow in Deuteronomy 13. There we are warned that if a prophet appears performing genuine signs and miracles, but telling us to do something other than what is commanded in the Torah, we are not to listen to him. He is a false prophet who has been sent to test us. Clearly, Amos could not have added a commandment to rest on the new moon, because that would have made him a false prophet. So why couldn't the merchants in Amos 8:5 sell their grain until the new moon passed? I want to propose an alternative explanation of this verse, an explanation that appears in the Targum Jonathan, an ancient Jewish translational commentary on the prophets. According to this explanation, the Sabbath in Amos 8:5 is not the weekly Sabbath, but the yearly Sabbath, what's called in English the sabbatical year. The sabbatical year is commanded in Leviticus 25, which says, 6 years you shall sow your field, but the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest for the land. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. We're not allowed to plant crops in the sabbatical year. In verse 5, it continues, and it speaks there about the aftergrowth, meaning grain that grows from seed that falls during previous year's harvest. In verse 5 it says, "That which grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap. It is a year of rest for the land." Some people stop reading here and erroneously conclude that we are not allowed to eat anything that grows during the sabbatical year. But actually the point of prohibiting a harvest is to allow anyone who wants to go into the field and cut as much grain as they need. This is explained in verses 6 and 7 of chapter 25. It goes on, it says, "But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female servants, the hired servants, and the bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield. So the prohibition is to carry out a centralized harvest. On the sabbatical year, everyone is allowed to go into any field and cut whatever they need for survival. This is why the merchants in Amos 8 are so eager for the sabbatical year to end. During the sabbatical year, their grain sits collecting dust in the storehouses. The poor don't need to buy any grain because they can simply go into any field and cut whatever they need. But as soon as the sabbatical year ends, grain prices will skyrocket and the merchants will be able to gouge the needy. This is what the prophet was talking about when he said in Amos 8, "Listen to you who devour the needy, annihilating the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon pass so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale? We will make the ephah small and the shekel great, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat." The ephah was a solid measure of volume like a modern bushel, and the shekel was a measure of weight. The merchants would deceitfully use smaller weights and measures when they were selling and larger ones when they were buying. This was all part of the price gouging of the poor. The rich merchants are desperate for the sabbatical year to end so they can get back to business as usual, selling their grain to the poor at high and unfair prices. If the Sabbath in Amos 8:5 is the sabbatical year, what about the new moon? Remember how we said that the Hebrew word for new moon also means month? According to the ancient Targum, the new moon in Amos 8:5 is actually the last month of the sabbatical year. Throughout that last month, the poor can get all the free grain they want by simply walking out to any field. At the same time, the reserve supply of grain from previous years is dwindling as the sabbatical year winds to a close. The merchants are desperately waiting for the month that ends the sabbatical year to pass so they can finally sell their grain at unfair prices to the poor. This is the ancient Jewish understanding of the verse presented in the Targum, and it lines up perfectly with what we read in the Torah. Amos is not saying it is forbidden to work on the new moon day. Amos could not say this because the Torah never forbids us to work on new moon day. Instead, Amos is just speaking about the month that ends the sabbatical year when the grain prices are teetering on the edge of skyrocketing. The point in Amos is that the merchants want to take advantage of the poor by charging unjust prices in order to enslave them. Now that we understand that the new moon is not a day of rest, let's get back to Nehemiah. We know full well exactly what was done up until the time of Hillel II. We have ancient documents which describe exactly how the biblical calendar functioned before Hillel II came along and changed it in 359. One of the ancient sources is actually a pre-Hillel II Pharisee source called the Mishnah, which has an entire tractate called the Tractate of Rosh Hashanah. And there it describes in great detail how when the temple stood, the court would interrogate new moon witnesses to find out when they saw it and where they saw it and what they saw. And based on that, they would proclaim that the new moon had been sighted in the land of Israel. And here's a really amazing account that appears in this Tractate of Rosh Hashanah, which tells about an actual new moon sighting that took place in Jerusalem. And it relates as follows. It says, "It once happened that Tobias the physician saw the Chodesh." Chodesh, remember we said, was the Hebrew word for new moon. So he saw the Chodesh, he saw the new moon in Jerusalem together with his son and his emancipated slave. The Sadducee priests accepted the testimony of Tobias and his son, but rejected the testimony of his slave. When they came before the Pharisee court, they accepted the testimony of Tobias and his slave, but rejected the testimony of his son. What this account tells us is that there were two courts, two judicial bodies convening in Jerusalem, one of the Sadducees, the other of the Pharisees, and they both received new moon testimony, and somebody who saw the new moon would actually go and testify before each court. And what this tells us is that with all the differences among the different factions in Jerusalem at the time of the Second Temple, the one thing all the Jews in Jerusalem agreed upon was that the month began with the sighting of the new moon. Well, this raises an interesting question of what we do today, because today we don't have a Pharisee court and we don't have a council of Sadducean priests who are sitting in the temple. And a lot of people have said because of this, they've asked the question, do we really have the authority to restore the original biblical calendar? In other words, we don't have a council to say we've seen the moon, so how do we know the moon has really been seen? And that's a very valid question, and let's examine this. And ultimately what these people are saying is that we have to continue to follow the Hillel II calendar, which has the stamp of authority of the last Sanhedrin in the year 359, approximately a little over 300 years after Yeshua's ministry. The reason we have to follow the Hillel 2 decision is because they were the last Sanhedrin, and today we don't have a Sanhedrin. We don't have that authority today. Well, before we decide whether we should continue to follow the decision of a Sanhedrin from 1600 years ago, let's understand what authority that Sanhedrin actually claimed. What was the authority claimed by the Sanhedrin? And we can find this out by actually looking back in this tractate of Rosh Hashanah and seeing a principle which is laid down there. And there the rabbis say as follows. They say, if the court and all Israel saw the new moon, and the witnesses were interrogated, but the court did not have time to declare it sanctified, meaning there was actually a ceremony where the members of the court would stand up after they heard new moon testimony and say, sanctified, sanctified, sanctified. If they didn't have time to make that declaration, the previous month is 30 days. What that means is, if the moon was seen after 29 days, remember you look after 29 days, and if it's not seen then it's the next evening by default. If you look for the moon after the end of 29 days, and all of Israel, hundreds of thousands of Israelites have seen the new moon, but the court hasn't said they've seen the new moon, the court hasn't proclaimed it so, then it's the next day by default. And the principle here that the rabbis are laying down is that the sighting of the new moon isn't what makes it new moon day. What makes it new moon day by definition is the proclamation of the court. Whether this moon is seen or not, whether the rabbis are even wrong or not, by definition what makes it new moon day is the proclamation of the court. And this comes out very clearly in a story which appears in the same tractate of Rosh Hashanah. There it tells what's actually a foundational story in Pharisee theology, which is the story of Rabbi Joshua and Gamliel II. Of course, you all have heard of Gamliel I, who is the teacher of Shaul, Paul of Tarsus. This is his grandson, Gamliel II, who was the head of the Sanhedrin shortly after the destruction of the temple. And the story goes as follows. One day, Rabban Gamliel II was receiving the testimony of new moon witnesses, and they came and they said something that was completely impossible. They claimed to have seen the new moon in such a way that everyone sitting there knew that this was impossible. They couldn't be telling the truth. It's impossible that the new moon was really sighted. And Rabbi Joshua hears this, and he realizes, wait a minute, they didn't really see the new moon, even though they claimed it. Well, Rabban Gamliel II accepted their testimony, and he was the head of the court. So this actually placed Rabbi Joshua in a very difficult situation. What does he do now? He knows that the new moon wasn't sighted, but the rabbinical court has proclaimed that it was sighted. So now he has a contradiction between the authority of the day and his conscience. Well, what he decides to do is he says, I'm just going to keep it in my house. And by the way, this was the 7th month, the month with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is a 24-hour fast. And if it was any other holiday, Rabbi Joshua would have kept each day for 2 days, one based on the actual sighting of the moon, and the other based on the proclamation of Rabban Gamliel. But here he can't do it. He can't fast for 2 days straight for Yom Kippur, for Day of Atonement. It's too difficult. So what he decides to do is he's going to keep it in his house and no one will know, and he just won't go to synagogue that day. Well, Rabban Gamliel hears about this and he says, absolutely not. Not only will you observe the day of Yom Kippur on the day that the court says, but in the day that you think is Yom Kippur, the day before, you will appear before me with your staff in your hand and your money purse at your side. And to a Pharisee, to be holding his staff in his hand and his money purse at his side is actually a public desecration of the day. You would only do that on a weekday, and on a non-holy day, you wouldn't do that on the Day of Atonement. So what Rabban Gamliel is actually ordering Rabbi Joshua to do is to publicly desecrate the day that he believes to be Yom Kippur. Rabbi Joshua doesn't know what to do. He's very distraught. So he goes and he seeks the advice of various rabbis. One of them, named Rabbi Dosa, a little-known rabbi, says to Rabbi Joshua, he says, you can't defy the proclamation of the court. They have the authority of Moses. They sit in the place of Moses. If you defy the court of Rabban Gamliel, whether he's right or wrong, you're defying Moses himself. Rabbi Joshua is very distraught over this. He doesn't know what to do. He now has this contradiction between his conscience of following the factual truth as he understands it and this authoritative decree of the court. He goes and he seeks further advice, and he goes to Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva sits him down. Rabbi Akiva was the greatest rabbi of the 2nd century, late 1st century, early 2nd century. And he says, Rabbi Joshua, it says 3 times in the Torah, you shall proclaim them, the appointed times. But you should read it as you yourself shall proclaim. What's he talking about? He was actually using an ingenious exegetical device, changing the vowels of one of the Hebrew words, changing the verse in Scripture to, you shall proclaim the appointed times, to you yourselves shall proclaim the appointed times. Let's look at what that is exactly. Leviticus 23 verse 4 says, these are the appointed times of Yehovah, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim them in their appointed times. And what that clearly says to anybody who casually reads that is you have to proclaim the appointed times. When do you proclaim them? In their appointed times. Rabbi Akiva, the first thing he did is he cut off the words in their appointed times. When he read it to Rabbi Joshua, he said, let's get rid of those words. They don't really make the point I'm trying to make. And then instead of reading it, you shall proclaim them, let's read it, you yourself shall proclaim. And what that now means, the way we're reading it now, and by the way, in Hebrew, that's the same consonants, just a change of certain vowels. What it now means is that whenever you proclaim those times is by definition when they are. You don't have to proclaim them when they're appointed. You have to proclaim them. You proclaim them whenever you decide to, you yourselves. And Rabbi Akiva explained what he meant. He said to him as follows. He says, you yourselves proclaim them, you being the rabbinical court. And what that means is even if you, the court, is accidentally wrong, even if you are intentionally wrong, and even if you are misled. And what this meant is the actual factual evidence, the actual factual information of when the moon was sighted is completely irrelevant. The holy days are by definition when the court proclaims them to be. Well, I have a real problem with this because that's not what it really says in Leviticus 23 verse 4. What it really says, as Rabbi Akiva knew very well, is that these are the appointed times of Yehovah, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim them. That's what it literally says in Hebrew. You shall proclaim them in their appointed times. Not whenever you feel like. It is your duty to proclaim them, but you don't appoint them. The Almighty in heaven, the Creator, appoints them. And so I have a hard time accepting this decision of Rabbi Akiva because he's telling me that the proclamation of the rabbis is what makes them appointed times and not the Creator. They become the feasts of the rabbis and not the feasts of the Lord. Generally, when you come to a rabbi and you say, why don't we go back to following the biblical calendar? Why are we following this Yah-Tube calendar, which is clearly not factually giving us the days when the moon is seen? They'll tell you the story of Rabbi Joshua, and the conclusion from that story is it doesn't matter when the moon is actually visible. It only matters when the rabbis say it's new moon day, with the moon sighted or not. Well, I simply, as a Karaite Jew, a Jew who only believes in the Old Testament, a strict adherent of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Scriptures, I can't accept this. And really, for me, I could stop right here. In other words, just based on Leviticus 23:4, I have to reject this rabbinical innovation which changes the biblical calendar. Over the past couple of decades, more and more people are beginning to follow this biblical calendar. And many of those that follow the biblical calendar are not even Karaites. Many are actually Messianic believers in Yahshua. And they often ask me, they say, okay, Nehemiah, based on the Old Testament, based on the Tanakh, in Leviticus 23:4, you don't follow the decree of the rabbis, you follow what you understand to be the scripturally true, divinely ordained timing of the days. But what about somebody who believes in Yahshua and looks to the New Testament? When should we keep the appointed times? Let me try to answer that question from a New Testament perspective by simply looking at some passages in the New Testament and seeing what they have to say on this topic. Before I get to that, though, let's look at what a well-known Messianic rabbi recently said on the issue to really understand what the problem is. He said as follows. He said, until Messiah comes back, who exactly has been given power over the remnant of Israel? Right or wrong, the rabbis remain in power until Yahweh himself restores all things. And what he's saying here is it's completely irrelevant what the scriptural truth is on this question. In other words, you may be interpreting scripture correctly, following the new moon and following the Aviv barley. It's completely irrelevant because the authority is in the hands of the rabbis, and the last rabbis who had that authority were Hillel II in 359 with his Sanhedrin. And until there's another Sanhedrin with that same authority, you must continue to follow what they said, whether they're right or wrong. Let's see if that really lines up with the New Testament, that idea. Here's an interesting passage, Acts chapter 5, verses 27 to 29. It talks about when the disciples are arrested, and it says as follows, having brought the apostles, they made them appear before the Sanhedrin. And by the way, this is not the Sanhedrin of Hillel II. This is the Sanhedrin that actually sat at the temple itself. The disciples were brought before the Sanhedrin to be questioned by the high priest. We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name, he said. Peter and the other apostles replied, we must obey God rather than men. And the answer here is that if the Sanhedrin itself gives you a direct order not to do something or to do something, if that order is contrary to what God has commanded, you must obey God, not men, because the Sanhedrin, that's just a bunch of men. That's not the word of God itself. And they don't have a divine authority. This is what Peter and the other apostles said. Another thing I hear, which is kind of comical to me, I hear many Messianic rabbis saying this all the time. They say, somebody who believes in Yahshua should follow the Hillel 2 calendar because the Karaites are considered heretics. And I think that's kind of funny as a Karaite Jew who only believes in the Hebrew scriptures. That's ironic because what they mean is that the Karaites are considered heretics by the rabbis, and of course we consider the rabbis heretics. But let's actually examine that statement in context. Let's say first of all that Karaites are considered heretics. Okay, we'll stipulate that for a moment. Does that mean you shouldn't follow something in Scripture because the Karaites happen to say the same thing? This would be like saying the Karaites keep the Sabbath. You shouldn't keep the Sabbath because the Karaites do it, because they're heretics. That doesn't make any sense to me. This is a question of scriptural truth, not of authority, and not of following a particular group. But let's put this in a little bit of context. The Pharisees, both in ancient times and in modern times, one of the standard prayers that they recite, they actually say the prayer 3 times a day, is something called the Amidah. The Amidah is the basic rabbinical prayer which has been recited in synagogues for at least 2,000 years. It's also known as the 18 benedictions. However, today it actually has a 19th benediction, which is known as the benediction against the heretics. The origin of this curse against all heretics is described in the Encyclopedia Judaica, where it says as follows. It says, Samuel HaKatan, around the year 90 of the Common Era, composed the benediction against the heretics included in the Amidah. This was directed primarily against Judeo-Christians. And you know who they mean when they say Judeo-Christians? They mean the early Jewish believers in Yahshua. It goes on either to keep them out of the synagogue or to proclaim a definite breach between the two religions. So, you know what? If the rabbis call me a heretic, at least I know I'm in good company. Another thing I hear from people all the time is, well, you know, it's so difficult to follow the biblical calendar because most people who are following the feasts are actually doing it based on the Hillel 2 calendar. And it's difficult to be different, and it's true, it is. However, it tells us in the Torah as follows. Exodus chapter 23, verse 2, we're commanded very clearly. It says, you shall not go after the majority to do evil. Neither shall you testify in a matter of strife to incline after the majority to pervert justice. And what this means is we can't follow the majority just because it's convenient or easy. We have to follow the truth no matter what everyone else does. Even if we're the lone voice of reason, we must cling to the truth. A while back I was examining this question of the New Testament vis-a-vis the biblical calendar, and I came across a very interesting passage. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 15, we read as follows. It's describing in this passage the various things that Yahshua accomplished in his ministry. And verse 15, it says, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it. And when I read this, I was curious, who are these rulers and authorities that Yahshua has defeated? Most Christian commentators who comment on this verse explain that the rulers and authorities are demonic forces, demonic powers that Jesus has defeated. But is that really what it means? Well, when I was trying to answer this question, I simply plugged in the Greek phrase rulers and authorities, which in Greek is archas and achousias. Archas and achousias, I plugged that into a concordance to see what do those words mean, how are they used. And I came across an interesting passage in Luke chapter 12, verse 11. And there Yahshua instructs his disciples. He says, when they bring you before the synagogues, the rulers and the authorities, the archas and the achousias, do not worry about how you are to defend yourselves or what you are to answer. And this is very interesting because the rulers of the synagogues, the rulers and authorities in Luke 12:11 is clearly not demonic powers or demonic principalities. It's clearly the rulers of the synagogues. And the people who rule the synagogues in this period and in this day and age were the Pharisees.